Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CII Scaffolding Joint Working Group breakout session. We're going to get started in just a moment.
Good to go.
All right. All right, Jay, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, Josh. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CII Community Business Advancement Session on Scaffold and Access Management. This has been a joint working group. It's comprised of both CII and non-CII members. Our membership includes owners, EPCs, vendors, scaffolding providers, AWP consultants, and software providers. This work group has been meeting every 2 weeks, and I know it's this work group. That didn't include me. Josh and I are chairing this group, but these folks need all the kudos in the world for their development of what's been done so far and what I think is going to be, a good thing in the future. And they're developing an AWP best practice document for scaffolding and access management. So while our research and documentation does focus on scaffolding, they haven't tried to include all the topic of access management more broadly. So thanks for joining this session, and we really look forward to hearing the questions at the end that you might have. Next slide, Steve. So this group, it was formed to address one of what I guess I would consider as an owner, one of our biggest areas of concern of project cost that are really difficult to manage. It's been up and down throughout our history, right? We do some jobs fairly well, some jobs we don't, but you're talking upwards of 20 to 40% of some of these projects revolve around scaffolding and access management. So despite this being, a large portion of our overall cost, scaffolding has not historically received the attention that it really deserves and the opportunity for our return on investment from, providing scaffolding and access management as a part of AWP. So the goal, I think, of this group was to create this AWP best practice handbook, and it specifically covers the scaffolding and access management portion. So if successful, the document itself will hopefully move the industry toward defining, an executable detail how we can realize advanced work packaging, planning, and productivity benefits into one of the greatest cost areas that I think projects see around scaffolding and access management. So without further ado, to kick off this session, I'm going to turn it over to our co-chair, Josh Gerb. Josh?
Thanks, Jay. So the intent of this session today is to update the greater community on the progress of the joint working group, as well as to recruit some folks to be participating in this effort. So this is the core group with a few additional folks that aren't represented here that have been contributing to this on a recurring basis. We want to make sure that we involve some other folks in the cold eyes review process of this document so that we have some challenge against that document, as well as opportunities to identify gaps or inconsistencies. So we are recruiting folks to participate in that and would like to have people join. In terms of what we're doing and the agenda today, we'll go through what we're doing and where we are in the process. Why are we doing this? So Jay talked a little bit about that, but scaffolding is a high cost area that hasn't been optimized and hasn't leveraged advanced work packaging to the fullest extent. Talk about how we approach the problem, what some of our findings have been, some of those key takeaways. So what should you remember from this? And then we'll open it up to a question and answer session at the end. So if there's any additional questions that you might have, there is a Slido for this session, so hopefully you'll be able to capture those questions throughout, and then we can address those at the end of our program. Next slide, please. So quick kind of who, what, where, when, where, the status of the overall project. The first draft of the document is complete and ready to go into a cold eyes review process. We're starting after this conference. And if you're interested in participating, you can email me, josh@o3.solutions, and we'll add you to the team. Like to have initial report out by the end of this year. And then in terms of contributors, you can see some of the folks who are here today, as well as some folks that are on the team and contributing that are not presenting here today. So those are kind of the core who, what, when, where of the joint working group. Next slide. In terms of our actual presenters today, my name is Josh Gervin, CEO of O3 Solutions. You already heard from Jay Moser, who is the PTE for Construction Fabrication Management AWP Program Champion at Shell. Colin Suey is the construction engineer with Fluor. Stefan Poach, I'm sorry, Stefan, I should have asked to get your pronunciation again. COO of Lair North America, Rick Dunlap, VP Technical Services and AWP Advocate within Brand Safeway, and then Robin Mickelson, who's the CEO of AWP University. So you see we have a diverse group, CII and non-CII members, as well as AWP experts and consultants, software experts, owners, and EPCs involved in this process. Next slide, please. So to get us kicked off, we're going to do first Slido. So Steve, if you could help folks with the Slido process, we'll have some interaction here. We want to collect some information here from the audience and help that to tailor our discussion. So Steve, could you please help with that? So this question actually, Stefan, maybe you could walk us through that question, make sure that everyone understands what we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. So basically, we want to ask the group a little bit of feedback, what their involvement is in Scaffold and Access, and obviously what the experience is in terms of real projects, to see are we on the right track? Are we really addressing the right problem? Or is there something else that we're missing? And from the responses that I can see that are coming in, that the cost overrun that also Jay mentioned earlier seemed to be almost always a fairly large big problem outside in construction. So Josh, we will have some more questions as we go along. Well, I guess we'll wait a few more seconds for responses to come in.
Yeah, with the first one, folks may need just a second, but hopefully we'll get those responses in quickly. All right, thank you, Steve. If we can flip back, we'll have a few more questions, so keep your Slido ready, as we will have more as we go through the presentation. Colin, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. So as Jay mentioned at the outset, and one of the reasons, the primary reasons we're doing this is because scaffolding is such a significant portion of project costs, and it being such a big portion of projects, the cost of poor access management is amplified by that much more. So what do we mean by that? What do we typically see on projects where scaffold costs become an issue? Well, today, scaffold is typically measured in terms of labor and in terms of material. So the labor for scaffold can run 15 to 30% of direct field labor hours, and it would not surprise me if some of you in the audience were to have examples that go even beyond that range. I've certainly heard of stories that go beyond that range. We always estimate in the lower end of that, but inevitably some projects end up on the higher end of that range. The other part is the cost of materials and the rental costs. Again, we typically estimate $1 per hour cost for scaffold, and oftentimes we end up higher than what we think initially it ends up being. So that's the cost of scaffolding itself in terms of labor and material, but there's also the less visible cost of scaffolding overruns. the cost of impacts to other parts of the project, the impacts to your direct field labor, the users of the scaffold that have to now wait for scaffolds, be reassigned to different tasks because of scaffolds, or for whatever reason are just held up and less efficient because of access issues. So some common issues that we've observed, and we'll go into a lot more detail about these through the presentation, but some common issues that we've seen can be summed up in terms of two major items: a siloed approach to scaffolding and AWP knowledge being limited in certain groups. So within siloed approach, we see a few different specific instances of this. First is each company arranges scaffold independently. So especially on a mega project where there are many, many players involved, you get companies that have scaffolding within their scope of work, and they arrange scaffold independently. They bring in their own scaffold contractor, and the scaffold in multiple silos within a project bring in multiple scaffold contractors that don't work with each other, whose scaffolds aren't compatible with each other, and that physically interfere with each other's ability to arrange scaffolding and erect and modify scaffolding. So that's one part of it. And then the other part is on the demand side, for the users of scaffold, disciplines and trades that request scaffold as needed, but without coordinating with each other. So the pipe fitters will request scaffold, the iron workers will request scaffold, the insulators will request scaffold, and the painters will request scaffold. But if you think about it, a lot of that scaffold might have been able to be done with a single structure, but instead it's requested multiple times and built and torn down multiple times. So the second part of common issues that we've observed is AWP knowledge being limited to certain groups. And within the context of advanced work packaging, scaffolding and access is treated as a constraint. That was how it originally was envisioned in AWP, but now we've come to realize that that is actually, there's a better way to approach that. Rather than treating scaffolding as something to be looked at in the moment of planning, we can actually push that way further up in the project cycle, and we'll talk about that as part of this presentation. And that means taking us out of the reactive or demand-driven mindset that we often think of scaffold and access management in, and taking access management to a proactive mindset. Next slide, please. So within that context of some of the issues that we've observed, we've defined a best practice, and we've broken that best practice into a framework of 6 major items that we wanted to cover. And that's what we'll go through in this presentation. We'll go through contracting strategies, the advanced work packaging framework. We'll talk about pre-planning ahead of getting to the field. And then once you get to the field, the execution planning and management of scaffolding. We'll talk about project controls. And we'll wrap up with education and training. How do we prepare all the folks on our projects to look at scaffolding and management and access management through the correct lens? And we'll discuss each of these in a lot of detail over the next. Next slide, please. So with that, we're ready for another Slido. Steve? Or sorry, this one's for Rick.
Yeah, the scaffold provider, access provider gets to ask this question, so this one's pretty fitting. The question's pretty straightforward. In your projects, do you consider scaffold a trade or discipline, or is it part of the total product installed by others, a piping contractor, equipment contractor, and the like? So I'm gonna answer this one myself, if that's okay, guys. I like this one. So sort of as Colin and Jay and others have touched on, right? How do we go from reactive mode to strategic mode? If access is diluted across multiple contract models and providers, how can I be strategic with that service? Well, it takes a very unique effort, or it doesn't happen, right? And so that's going to be a focus of a lot of the content in the presentation. So I understand it's treated as an individual trade. I wonder, I wonder if it's treated as a shared service, right? We'll get to that concept a little bit later. Looks about right, I guess. That's the way most people interpret it. I think we're going to try and change your mind about if that's what's really happening today a little bit.
Is this what people want to think, or is this?
That's my point, yeah. So I think we're going to change their mind a little bit about it. We all understand access providers are a trade or a craft, but how are they treated on an AWP project? So I'm going to jump into my content. So I've gravitated to the AWP framework. I think it's a great model. It's helped us tremendously. It's helped projects in a lot of ways. I think it's providing a lot of results, especially in the heavy crafts. I think as it relates to scaffold or access, I think we've seen less than the same results. And I think that's why this joint work committee has been put together. The advantage of using AWP sort of as the vessel to kind of help us get to the next level is that, it does give us that common framework of, standard language around what we're talking about in data standards. But I think there's still a couple missing elements, and kind of jumping to the challenges. If, our experience and many of the team members is that when we're on a project site, we see many contract models in the project ecosystem. And there's a single spin point of access for a client who's paid for a project to be built. How do we help as that ecosystem manage to that, right? And so we're kind of tied into a siloed approach by contracts many times, and so there needs to be some thought put to that. As an example, the prime contract may be AWP aligned, but many of the cascading, subcontractors on a project may not be as well aligned. And, one of the big things that became sort of evident in this working committee was the project team sitting in the trailer or sitting, in the boardroom related to the project. Their awareness and vision is very good about what AWP and what the project deliverables are supposed to be. It's those downstream supporting functions and the extended organizations, not only in the owner's organization, but in the provider's organizations, that they really don't understand what the AWP strategy and what the potential value of leveraging it could be for the project. So what we see is the results are really pretty straightforward. It's sort of, every person for themselves on a project. When the project gets into the heat of, the peak of construction activity, we end up with multiple access providers and multiple methods of providing access, because everyone's really focused on managing their contract, their expected % complete outcomes, and all of those items. They're managing that contract, not the outcome of the project a lot of times. And that's not their issue directly, but I think as a group, it's all of our issues. But ultimately what happens is there's really a lack of control around access spend and really understanding where all the costs went, and more importantly, how can we save some of those costs in the next lesson learned, right? Or in the next project through lessons learned. So part of what we've identified and what'll be in the actual draft document is some commercial strategies that support AWP, driving data standards and really driving outcomes. And then drive and own at the owner level. Don't hand that off, but drive and own it at the owner level and cascade that through all the functional teams, not only in their organization, but all the providers on the job site. And when I say providers, that could be mechanical contractors, that could be anyone that's needing access or providing access. And what we really end up with is a much more robust, aligned access management approach. We have a more strategic approach versus reactive. We understand requirements, we understand what the data needs are, and we can actually control the project. Okay, next slide. So, next slide, please. There we go. So I just want to reference sort of, one of the challenges we've had, or I've personally had, is access has always really been treated as a constraint. If you look at the traditional AWP model, what it says is access isn't really thought about until the work's already defined and there's a scope identified, and then we go and exercise or relate, perform that constraint, satisfy it in a very one-to-one basis. There's very little thought or dedicated effort earlier in the process to say we're working in a module. I can do this much more strategically, and I could satisfy many scopes of work with one single access delivered in the field. So if you look on the right, the way I look at it today, the reason we haven't seen big gains in scaffold and access performance on AWP projects is because whether we're working it just like non-AWP projects would work it, we've identified a scope of work and we take care of that scope of work on a very one-to-one basis. That constraint management, while it's important, that helps us do our lean things, that helps us focus on productivity, that helps us manage schedule and resource and those type items. It does set us up to be working multiple streams around individual constraints, and we're only as good as the craft that has the constraints ability to pre-plan and keep work in front of us strategically. So what we've seen is that Scaffold is lagging behind in terms of AWP results, and really and truly it's driven by the lack of a cohesive access strategy. And we continue to be managed in a very siloed approach, contract by contract. So what we've kind of come away with and what we're identifying in the document in the first draft is think of access as a shared service provider type environment. Doesn't mean an individual provider, it just means anything to do with access is thought of as a shared service provider, and everyone should have the same language and the same data standards. The way we can really add value is understand at the CWA and CWP level who's doing what in terms of work activity, what's the most strategic way to provide access for the most scopes of work at a single time. Instead of building individual scaffolds for each field weld out there, maybe we could come up with some alternative ways, or maybe we could provide a decking system or a much more robust approach at it versus individual constraints. The ultimate goal is really to be able to satisfy these, not only for piping craft or insulation craft or electric craft within a CWP, but to begin to think about how can I provide strategic access for multidisciplines, right? So intradiscipline and interdiscipline is really the ultimate goal of this exercise. Next slide. So, I'm gonna give this one some color, but is the impact of scaffold and access to the work being performed by others critical or important? So that's the Slido question, if you'll go ahead and do that now. The answer for me is pretty straightforward. I think a variety of people have said scaffold and access hours can be 20, 30, 40% of the hours on a project. But when you consider how many hours that access actually impacts, we impact 80 or 90% of the hours on a project. So if we're in a chaotic mode and we're not being strategic, we're definitely not only impacting the direct cost of providing that access, but even more importantly, we're impacting the cost of the access users that need, fit for purpose access and the like. So very big deal.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the answers are pretty straightforward. If you need to weld a pipe and it's in the air, you need access. So it's not always a scaffold, but certainly need access. So I think that one's I think that's the grand prize winner there, Josh. We can probably move to the next slide now.
Yeah.
That's a slam dunk as it's gonna get.
Oh, Well, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Colin. I think the question also showed a little bit that just to get people to think about the impact that scaffold really has on the other trades and how important it is. Because, and that's also what I liked about this group, I think we're really zooming in very well on the problem description that because scaffold is an afterthought, we don't really, or we too often forget about the opportunities that are there for the project in terms of schedule and cost. Maybe to repeat, we talked about this a couple of times, right? If scaffold is a constraint, obviously if we remove the constraint, we have constant progress. But that also means that each scope gets its own little scaffold. So the piping, insulation, electrical structure. And if you ever walked around a big construction site, you may wonder, what are all these scaffolds, individual scaffolds doing here? Why do we have scaffold congestion? And you don't need to be a manager to understand that this probably has a lot of process issues or cost overruns and things of that nature. So what is a potential goal? A potential goal is obviously to integrate scaffold into the planning process to make it more visible in the project. So let me give you an example on the pipe break that I was just talking about. Instead of building a bunch of individual scaffolds, the goal could be to build what we would call a one-to-many or a multi-purpose scaffold or a platform. So some structure that doesn't serve one trade or one scope specifically, but that reaches out and serves multiple trades at the same time. So that would be a more efficient way. Now, many might say like, well, you know, planning scaffold is tricky because obviously we don't even know the change. We don't even know, you know, what exactly we're building in construction. It just unfortunately has to wait or stay a constraint. So just for the mindset, our goal is not to plan every individual scaffold tower on a mega project. The goal is just to basically capture the main major scope, which might be 30%. So next slide, please. So, see. Yep, one back. Yeah, so the major scope. Now, one could also say that, well, it might be easy to just get scaffold and access a seat at the CWP level. The more critical scope will be, as we mentioned earlier, is, you know, in too many times we see, or when we discussed it, this, every trade is for themselves. How do we get everybody to collaborate together? So that's why, as Rick and Colin mentioned earlier, it's so important not just to integrate scaffold to the planning side, but also to provide an ecosystem that they can actually collaborate. If you think about it, everybody that needs to work at height needs to have scaffold and access. So that's really a denominator or an integrator among all of them. So as an ecosystem, and we hear in the very early discussions in terms of what we can do as a solution is obviously we want to have scaffold recognized as a core discipline with scaffold experts that understand what an electrical scope is, what insulators needs are, and things of that nature, not just necessarily in putting together a scaffold. Scaffold as a shared service, obviously, so that people will realize it, that they can have access to this and don't need to integrate or bring their own scaffold to the project site. Just mention it, foresight planning. So if there is something coming up, always keep in mind scaffold needs to be on the table. The most challenging part, as you can imagine, is to get everybody to collaborate, right? So number one, obviously, is to have a common language and data standards so that everybody knows basically what we're talking about in terms of how to request a scaffold, how a scaffold should look like, and how you charge for scaffold. Obviously, it also helps with accountability. So, and maybe as a side note, one of the discussions that we have, and maybe seek input later on, is obviously how can we optimize and institutionalize the collaboration among the trades? Because as we mentioned earlier, most of the time it's really everybody for themselves. Last but not least, very important is it needs to be, we think it needs to be owner driven because it's somewhat of a cultural change. As Rick mentioned, rather than each trade by themselves, somebody needs to make sure that from now on, everybody needs to collaborate in terms of access and scaffold, and that might be a different mentality or cultural change to the project. So the owners need to be involved. They cannot just leave it up to the GC or the EPC or the individual trades. So, but ultimately, we think that number one, we can build a more effective scaffold if we have common language and common data standards, because that will ultimately reduce also the unplanned modifications on site. But we also build a more efficient scaffold because instead of building individual towers, we are now able to build these multi-purpose scaffolds. So, yeah. Next slide, Josh.
All right, so with that talk about common language and data performance, we're going to come up on the project control section. Before we do that, we have another Slido question. So if you can pull up your phones, we'll answer this one. Do you measure scaffold performance? Oh, I'm seeing a different Slido question come up on my phone. There we go. Do you measure scaffold performance?
It is anonymous, so you can answer accurately.
So we're seeing some preliminary results come in. Scaffold performance is not yet measured, is about half the answers. About a third of the answers is measured on individual projects. And we're seeing those numbers level out at around those levels. So that's interesting to see. So somewhere between not yet measured and measured on individual projects is where we're ending up. All right, back to the slides. So that's an interesting poll to see, and what we hope to do with this best practice, or this draft of the best practice, is to introduce some different ways to think about how we measure scaffolding on a project, and hopefully be a little more rigorous about what we do. And the key point that you're going to see when you read through the best practice is that quantities enable rigorous project controls. And right now, at least among the folks that were on the committee that drafted this best practice, quantities were not well tracked throughout the project lifecycle. And by that, I mean the initial estimating is not done in using quantities. The initial estimate is done using hours, and then we factor material rental costs off those hours. So we think that using a quantity-based estimate, including the access duration, because scaffold tends to be a time-based material, we'll be able to have a lot more rigor in how we do project controls. So starting with a quantity-based estimate, and then using that quantity-based estimate through the duration of the progress, which enables typical project controls methods like earned value progress. Without quantities, you can't do earned value, and estimating quantities lets you do that very important step to know how far along a project is in using up its scaffold budget, and triggers the right notifications and the right advanced flags when you're not going according to plan. And having that quantity basis also gives you an extra lens in looking at change management and forecasting. So not only saying we're over budget or under budget or whatever the case may be, but knowing why you're over budget. What specific aspects of scaffolding are running over? Is it too many hours being spent? Is it the material is costing more than you estimated? Are you building more scaffolds than you intended? Or are the scaffold builds more elaborate than you intended? So quantities lets you answer all those questions and track projects in a way, or track scaffolds in a way that we're not tracking on most projects today. Another important component of the best practice is looking at cost accountability for scaffolding. Right now, scaffolding tends to be its own cost account, which means if the scaffold cost is running over, it's the scaffolding superintendent or the scaffolding coordinator who's responsible for that. Well, the scaffolding superintendent tends, at least for projects today, tends to just be filling requisitions. Somebody puts in a requisition, they build the scaffold. There's not much discretion in whether or not they build that scaffold. They have some control on how the scaffold is built, but not whether or not the scaffold is needed. And to the point that Rick and Stefan made earlier in the presentation, how many scaffolds are being built, they have very little control over. So we're with this best practice, what we suggest is shifting that cost accountability, and instead of tracking scaffold as one big bucket, we track scaffold costs by requester or by end user, whether that's contractor specific or discipline or trade specific within your project. We also want to separate out some components that are not necessarily directly comparable between projects. So for example, if you have a project that's being executed in a cold climate, your scaffolds are often use scaffolding material, for heating and hoarding. Well, if you're in a warm climate, you wouldn't use any scaffold for that. So that's a component that you need to carve out in order to truly compare access cost apples to apples. And another part of cost accountability is incentivize alternate means of access. Building a scaffold makes a lot of sense when you need to repeatedly access the same work front over and over by multiple people. But when there's certain instances where you're only doing a quick inspection, for instance, it might not make sense to spend 40 or 50 hours to build a scaffold, have someone go up, use a scaffold for 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours, and come back down. It might make sense to use drones or use a scissor lift or some other equipment. So it's not always cheaper to do that, but there are cases where it is, and having a cost structure that incentivizes at least considering those alternate means of access is we think will lead to better scaffold costs. And the last component of the best practice in terms of project controls is metrics and benchmarking. And this goes back to what Stefan said about having that common language and common data standards, and not just within a project, but between projects too. So within the best practice, we recommend some leading and lagging indicators that have been used on previous projects and have shown to be successful. And now having quantity basis, assuming that we have quantity basis, some additional leading and lagging indicators that can be considered. And the last part of the metrics and benchmarking is having some way to compare scaffold between projects. And that's something that's been difficult to do, mostly because there are so many ways of measuring scaffold. We talk about quantity as part of this best practice, but there are so many ways to measure quantities. And one of the suggestions in here, and this is going to take a lot of industry consensus, and this is where your input as part of this review process is very much necessary, is can we as an industry agree on some common unit of measure that we can use for benchmarking, and that benchmarking is going to enable us as an entire industry to benchmark the improvements that we hope to achieve with this best practice. So next slide, please.
So are we going to have a common unit of measure, Colin?
We are suggesting we need to talk about it, but it is that's probably one of the most hotly debated topics as we were going through the reviews internally leading up to this draft, for sure, John.
There were a few arm wrestling matches over that one.
And there were some bribes of barbecue being thrown about too, just saying.
There you go. All right, so next section. So to ask the next question, do you include scaffold and access management resources into your AWP training program? Well, let's switch to the question. I'm not seeing it.
Pop us over to slide OC.
There we go.
There it is.
All right, let's see if we can get some results. All right, doesn't look like we got a connection, Steve. There we go. All right, so we're almost running down the middle. Looks like, okay, No's taking the lead. I'm surprised at that. As we're moving forward with taking the lead on developing some of these systems, AWP training when it comes to scaffold and access management is definitely one of those key aspects. And I'm pleasured that some people are definitely including training within their organization for scaffold management. I would like to think in my experience, or at least what I've seen, that it's not readily trained internal on the project as to how to request, add, and manage scaffolds. Still a little bit of a Wild West in that area, which is why we are here, and why this group has kind of come together to help set those standards. So if you move to the next. All right, so when we're talking about training and education in regards to access management, there's a couple things that we need to consider. We need to look at it from, well, 3 basic positions to start with, and those 3 basic positions being awareness training, execution training, and early scoping training. So what are those areas? What are we really talking about when we're talking about those 3 basic areas, and who needs to take it? Let's go to the next slide and we'll dive into it a little bit deeper. When we're talking about education in these areas, especially when we're talking about awareness training, what are we talking about? We're talking about the basis of what it is that we do for a site, an organization, or a project in regards to access management. It could be a basis of training within the induction training on every site. Or it could be just a basic blurb on how it is that this particular organization manages their scaffolding. Who's this for and what's it for? Who's it for? It's basically for anybody that's going to be part of that particular project or organization so that they understand how and what is expected. Then when we go to early scoping training, now this is extremely important because one of the aspects that we've covered within this particular group and this research team is talking about the requirements of scaffold planning earlier and how it is that you can save a lot of the budget when you start planning for, say, larger dance floor type scaffolds in the place of multiple small scaffolds that are built and torn down readily. A lot of that early scope planning and training is about how you do these sessions, how you host these sessions to ensure that you can start to identify both budget and as well as low-hanging fruit for helping to optimize the scheduling of the scaffolding program. And then, of course, execution training, how we manage it, how we request it, how it's part of the AWP program. In AWP, how is it called out from the IWPs? When those installation work packages are activated, they're issued, and the crew has them, how is it that they're tied to the scaffolds? How are those scaffolds transferred for ownership? How is ownership tracked for multiple use so that the electricians, the pipe fitters, QA, QC, all the above actually get their say in what scaffolds are required? So execution training, how we do it, how we manage it, all extremely important. So from those 3 bases, starting from how we do it and what we're going to do, and then training from the basis of how we need to control this. These 3 different aspects, 3 different groups of people, but we need to bring this forward to create awareness so that everybody gets on the same page when it comes to training within an organization or just a project in general. So thanks, I'll hand it back to you, Josh.
Excellent. Next slide, please. And then going to have Rick share some of the key takeaways from today. And those of you who haven't picked up on it yet, Rick is very knowledgeable in this area. So if you're willing to come either pay for some barbecue or join one of our sessions, you can pick up a lot of knowledge from Rick. So we're going to have him summarize some of the key points that we talked about today.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. Barbecue is definitely a good catalyst for thought leadership, I would say. Again, this group was a pretty diverse group. I will say that a lot of good perspectives, but at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is everyone's saying the same thing from those different perspectives. And I think we've kind of boiled it down to 5 or 6 key things. 5 of them are here. One thing we know, access management is a common denominator for almost every work activity in a construction project. The real opportunity here is to think of it as a shared service, not as an individual provider necessarily, but as a shared service, regardless of how many providers you have. The other thing that's pretty evident is we have to shift from just managing our own individual contracts as a piping contractor, electrical, or an access provider, and be focused on managing outcomes. And we said a couple of times that we really need the owners to help us with that, right? And we don't need them to do it all, but we need them to provide the guardrails to help drive that change in commercial strategy. As Robin just mentioned, education is really critical. And, I brought it up earlier as well. As I think as a project team, there's 5 or 10 people that sit around the weekly project update, and they all understand what AWP is and what's important. The challenge is how do we cascade that to our extended organizations and bring everyone into that conversation? Last but not, almost last but not least, one of the other things that Colin touched on is there's still a bit of a, I think people tend to want to stick with their own approach, and that's fine. I understand that, but we have to have some level of standardization. AWP provides a nice vessel to help us, have that framework and language, driving out some data standards, and then getting help from our clients to say everyone will play nice in the ecosystem commercially. Those are things that help us drive standardization. And then sort of, one of the journeys I've been on, working with the AWP conference for several years is access really does need to be treated as a discipline. If we're not, then how can we really talk about, getting away from ad hoc planning and thinking strategically about providing access, right? Versus just constraint management. Constraint management's no different than typical construction methodologies. So we have to kind of shift gears there. We need the AWP, thought leadership to help change that in the model. So that's sort of so far the key takeaways. There may be a couple of more that kind of simmer up to the top, but it's been a great group, a lot of good work done. So thanks for letting me participate.
Absolutely. And I think that AWP framework one we had a lot of rich conversation around how if you start to treat scaffolding and access management as a shared service and as its own discipline, well, then naturally you start to include it in education. You start to think about it, a commercial strategy necessary to support that. You start to need to have standardization, and then you start to need to have a framework or approach. So it's really all that kind of follows this idea of we need to start thinking about this thing that can be 20 to 40% of the cost of the project. We need to start thinking about it as a real thing that has an impact on all these other aspects of the project, and we need to include it in our project execution optimization strategy, which is AWP. So that I think is a lot of this builds on that core piece of, hey, we really need to think about access management as a real shared service in its own, treat it like its own discipline in terms of planning.
Yep.
Okay, with that, if we could go to the next slide, one quick request from folks here. If you are willing to participate and would like to enjoy some additional discussions on scaffolding and potentially barbecue, please shoot me an email and we'll add you to the list. Would love to have some additional participation. Already had a number of folks who have signed up to provide some cold eyes feedback. Obviously, we've put a lot of time and effort into this. But for this to be something that helps move the industry forward, we're going to need to ensure that it passes the test with folks outside of just the authors. So we want some people to poke holes in it and see opportunities to improve it and give us candid feedback. So if that sounds like something you're interested in helping us with, we'd really appreciate that.
Hey, Josh, and I want to call to the owners right here. I mean, Shell's doing this, obviously. I think we all as owners have an understanding of what's at stake here. I think beyond that, and I don't want to get into answering some of the questions ahead of time, but I would say that I see opportunity beyond just what's being done here. I mean, what's the link between design for manufacturing and assembly here? How can we better fabricate our stuff such that the scaffolding can be utilized, with that in mind? How can we take this into the CSU realm? How can we take, FP 364 that we're doing for the commissioning and how does the system turnover get implemented in here. So there's a lot more work to do with this work group beyond what's been identified. And I'm throwing darts at you guys without even having the discussion, but these aren't darts. These are opportunities that we need to overcome and to address that will make this ultimate impact that we've talked about.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great lead into our questions. So Steve, if we could flip over to Slido and we can share some of those questions. I think we've got 6 or 7 already in there. Please continue to add those, and then we're going to address those. I'll try to share those out. But you know, I think maybe Rick, maybe you could add some thoughts on how to get all the trades to collaborate on scaffolding, and then if other folks want to jump in there as well.
Yeah, so my approach has been to really approach the owner and let us sort of be the coordination resource. If they all need access, you know, one of the things we touched on is the common denominator is for work in the field is access. And, you know, then Colin touched on a couple of topics, right? So how do we show who's a good actor and a bad actor in terms of when they need access, when they let us know, and which ones are driving, you know, unplanned work and those type things. So having a nice standard, you know, KPI model and having an owner that's engaged to help change behaviors on site is really important. So in a nutshell.
And Steve, if you could clear that trades collaborating one at the top, and then how are scaffolding change requests handled and tracked? Maybe Colin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the way the scaffold is tracked right now. The scaffolds are based with the scaffold labor being a percentage of DFL hours. So the only way you really get scaffold changes is when you change the direct scope. When you do, you get a proportionate amount of scaffold hours and scaffold costs that come with it. That's typically how I've seen it done. So when you need it, but outside of that change in direct scope, when additional scaffold work is needed, it's not really a change. It just goes into the general scaffold budget. And that's where I think we run into a lot of issues, and that's what we hope to address by moving to a quantities-based project controls framework.
And in that scenario, when you exceed the estimate, then you just track your overages against this single bucket of scaffold for the project. Yeah,
and then the issue is sometimes you don't even know you're over the budget, because if you're 25% of the way into the project, even if you're running 50% over, you don't necessarily see that you're running over the estimate yet. You don't know that you're running over the estimate until you're far too late into the project to do anything about it. And
do you see a similar kind of curve that we do in other quantities where it can be misleading, where early in the project it looks like it's recoverable, but then you have the productivity factor collapse in the end of the project? Do you see similar things where you have a false sense of performance early?
Outside of scaffolding, you mean, Josh?
No, with scaffolding, do you have a false sense of performance early in the project that then falls apart late in the project?
Yeah, and I can give some examples of this. Is, let's say you're building a very tall structure, let's say a coker tower. A lot of your effort is going to be spent up front building the initial access to that coker tower, and then you're kind of on a very steady small modifications throughout the life of that job, and then towards the end you have all that effort to take that scaffold down. So if you look at the actual scaffold effort on a project like that, it's you get a hump at the beginning, a bit of a low in the middle, and then another hump at the back. It's not linear, but that curve has a unique shape, and different projects have different profiles of what that curve looks like. And I think moving to a more quantities-based estimate will let us know, what that curve ought to look like from a plan perspective. And when it actually happens, we're unfolding, we're not surprised that we're burning a little more hours here or a little more hours there, or that we need to save some hours for later on in the project.
Excellent. So next question, what do you see as the biggest misunderstanding of how AWP can be applied to access management? Robin, do you have some thoughts on the biggest misunderstanding of how AWP can be applied?
I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is when we start talking about access management and AWP is that people start to assume that we want to work package everything scaffolding. Where we're not looking at creating full IWPs for scaffolding, we're not looking at creating CWPs and those types of things for scaffolding. What we're doing is talking about the integration of it into the planning, and that IWPs for other trades key into the planning for scaffolding. That scaffold requests from the planners become a mainstay and a standard way of organization rather than the foreman standing and pointing, which tends to be more the activity of getting a scaffold than it coming through a planned environment. So I think the biggest misconception is that everybody thinks that AWP has to restructure how everything is managed in scaffolding. We're just looking to get a lens into scaffold planning and bringing it tighter to how we plan the other trades.
Stefan, did you have some thoughts on that? I saw you nodding your head a little bit.
No, I was agreeing with Robin on it. So.
Okay. Next question, how do you approach scaffolding estimate management for a brownfield project, assuming it will be approached differently compared with a greenfield project? Maybe Rick, you could add some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we look at that process the same, quite honestly. It's just like safety. I don't plan safety different for brownfield than I do greenfield, but are there some unique challenges related to brownfield versus greenfield? Certainly there are. One of the things that we have to plan for is the unplanned more on brownfield, because your teams often discover, activities that you didn't anticipate quite often, right? Whether it's in an outage or a brownfield project or whatever it may be. So we sort of plan for the unplanned, and we have standard process, and we certainly rely on work phase planning approaches for the access. And the more leeway we get, the more we can think strategically about those individual work phase planning items, if that makes sense.
Maybe I can add to that. Also within the group, we discussed not necessarily brownfield, but for turnaround projects. Oftentimes the advantage is that the scope is very well known. So it really helps, or it's really a lot easier to plan detailed scaffold and access requirement and what needs to be when and where. That usually has major, like we've shown before, major impacts on the turnaround speed, right? How fast you can do the turnaround. So maybe that can be considered as well.
Absolutely. All right, next question, brass tacks here. What kind of ROI can I expect? So Jay, I know this is probably a difficult one to answer, but as the owner who understands the pain of the inefficiencies of scaffolding, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I link this whole scaffolding and access management back to how can we improve productivity, right? This is a mechanism that can affect that in a positive or negative way very much. So to me, you go back to fundamentals. This is about how am I allowing the work phase or the workers to be more on their tools? What is their direct time on the tools that they're working on? If you can't give them that access to be on that tool, and you're delaying that because if it's a scaffold or material or whatever it might be, then the productivity chance of being productive will go down. So, for me, I'd say that this scaffolding could impact direct time on tools. In a brownfield environment, I would say a bit more, but in a greenfield environment, well, I shouldn't say that. I don't know that for a fact. But the bottom line is, you could have an excess of a 10%, ROI on or time on tools improvement if you do scaffolding better. And that's just my gut number. I'm not getting that from research or a cereal box. That's just my gut.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I think I'll answer what's next for the joint working group. One of the areas that we're considering is the ROI associated with scaffolding. So if you're interested in participating in that, would love to have you join. And then maybe
Josh, I'd like to offer a different perspective on that as well. Is in terms of ROI, there's the we think about project costs in terms of the actual dollars, but I think another aspect to this best practice is it will give you cost certainty on a project. So even assuming, and this is a bad assumption, but even assuming there's no cost difference, if you know at the outset of the project what the scaffold number will be at the end of the project within a much narrower band than we do today, I think that in itself is valuable to the project. Just
Great point
on that one.
Great point. So I think we have time maybe for one more on, we can touch on where the permanent platforms were considered in our research. So alternative forms of access beyond scaffolding, including a permanent platform. So maybe Colin, you could add a couple of thoughts on that, and then if others want to jump in as well.
Yeah, we didn't really address that to a lot of detail in the best practice. I can speak from experience on projects. That's really a front-end design philosophy that gets considered during your feed phase. Even by the time you get into detailed engineering, it's often too late to be putting in that platform. It is a design philosophy question. One of the considerations that we did talk about was using those alternate means of access. So not just leaving room, not just having scaffolds in as part of the planning, but where can we use an aerial work platform? Where can we use scissor lifts? Where can we use rope access? And on those very narrow instances where it makes sense, where can we just fly a drone and take some high-def video? Because that's, in some cases, that's as good as getting an access. And we're also seeing, from a technology perspective, some drones and some robotics that are capable of doing very simple tasks. I know in my company, our maintenance subsidiary is exploring robots that can do some painting tasks and some very, very basic welding tasks without having personnel access. So those are different things that we need to think about, not just in terms of permanent platforms, but in terms of how we design our plants to enable those kind of technologies when they become mature enough that we can capture the value from them for new and existing plants.
Yeah, and I think that's one area that tied into the most controversial area that we talked about, which was this common unit of measure, where we looked at, should that be leg feet or should that be volume? Should that be weight? And we had a number of different areas where we struggled there in that conversation. And how do you compare different types of access makes that more complicated. If you have a permanent platform, how does that compare? If you can fly a drone up, how does that compare? So I know that's one area where we had some trying to understand how you measure access, for example, of comparing flying a drone up for visibility versus having to build access to lift a human. How do you compare those two scenarios? So there is some nuance there. I think, unfortunately, we may have lost Rick. I was going to ask him for his thoughts on that. Hopefully, he'll be able to come back and join us. But with that, I think we've covered our main questions. We may have a few folks left here, and maybe we can talk about, as we close, some of the KPIs that we've thought about here. So Colin, maybe you could add some of the KPIs that we've discussed from a project controls perspective, and then others, we could have maybe Robin add some thoughts on what KPIs matter from a training perspective as well.
Yeah, and I'll try not to go into the nitty-gritty detail, knowing that this is meant to be a high-level presentation. I do invite everyone to have a look at the best practice where the full list is there. But I think one of the, and instead of a main KPI, because I think the main KPIs are, what is your scaffold labor cost and what is your scaffold material cost? Those already exist. I think what's more interesting is what are the new KPIs that we're talking about? And that is, it ties into what both Rick and Stefan talked about in the presentation, which is how do we encourage those one-to-many scaffolds, or those scaffolds where one scaffold hits multiple contractors, multiple disciplines. So what the KPI that we suggested for that is looking at how many scaffolds are being requested by each trade or discipline or contractor, whatever you're trying to measure by, and also have a category of how many scaffolds requested by those disciplines or trades involve other disciplines or trades. In other words, how many scaffolds are one-to-many scaffolds versus one-to-one scaffolds. I think that kind of KPI that really incentivizes the behavior you want is, those are the KPIs that we're introducing that we think can really change the game on how scaffold is measured on a project, and not just measure it, but incentivize it the right way. And Stefan, I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'm thinking right now, you know, some of the way I look at it is obviously a lot of times we hear that piece count is used, right? Not necessarily as a KPI, but just as a general estimating tool. In Europe, maybe in the US too, volume is encouraged because it would probably encourage a more productive build. Instead of using a bunch of parts and pieces, you would try to build a very efficient structure that builds up fast. But I think overall, there's really no agreement or across the industry who uses what, right? As a scaffold provider, I would probably go to pieces because every piece needs to be transported to the construction site. As an owner, I'm probably more interested in volume because I really don't care how many pieces you need to build that scaffold as long as you build it. So I think there will probably be a lot of discussion, and it'll be interesting to see. Yeah, different KPIs drive different behaviors. That's definitely something to keep in mind as well, right?
Yeah, Stefan, and that's a great point. I think when we were going through the list of KPIs, that was one of the things we debated back and forth on. You know, in some cases, what units to use, which KPI makes more sense, and it took us a while, but we finally came to this point of realizing there's a certain set of KPIs that work really well for the scaffold contractors, the folks that are actually building the scaffold, and there is an equivalent KPI that makes more sense for your owners, your EPCs and GCs to use. And they're different units, but they essentially measure the same thing, but they measure it in a way that's useful depending on which part of the value chain that you're on. And that was, I think, one of the insights that, for me anyway, that I didn't walk in with, and I'm glad I walked out of those conversations with.
Yeah. I think early on and during the implementation of a program, sometimes the simplest KPIs are the most impactful. And the first one that I would look at is planned versus unplanned scaffold builds. And planned versus unplanned, it's going to tell you if your program's being effective. If you've got a lot of unplanned, it's time to assess, reassess, and fix it, right, before it gets to be too big a bear. That's going to be my main go-to initially. To identify the health.
Yeah, and if you follow a more agile approach, you can call that distraction scaffolds, right?
Yeah, Josh, and maybe I'll end this with, you know, what you monitor, you can control. So if you're not monitoring it, you're not going to control it. That's the bottom. If you can't build, and in this case, I'll call it a sine curve. It's more of a sine curve, right, than it is a bell curve or a progress curve, an S curve. But if you can't monitor it, then you can't control it. So whatever you do some monitoring.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that is all the time we have for questions. Went a little bit over and ate into your lunch, so apologize for that. Want to thank everyone on the panel for participating, and thank you for the audience for your time today. Hopefully you learned something. I know that we all have learned through this process and have really enjoyed this. So please reach out if you're interested in helping with this effort. With that, I think we'll conclude our session. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.